So I'll use this time now so welcome everybody. Just to say, this session will be recorded, but only the lecture part will be recorded. We won't record the Q&A. Today actually we'll be using another format compared to last week. Today everybody will be able to intervene through, through audio, video. We don't have to use the chat to ask questions, but please don't, obviously, let's not intervene during the presentation itself, but let's keep all questions for the Q&A. Okay, so I mean, let's assume it's starting now. Welcome everybody to this second session of our seminar series in comparative social policy, which really focuses this year on the major challenges of the day, well, inequality, global change, global warming, technological change, COVID last week, and this week we have a very topical presentation given current developments, political developments, and policy developments in the US, a presentation on minimum wages in the US. And as many of you know, President Biden has just announced, and it was also part of his program, that the federal minimum wage will be doubled or more than doubled to $15 per hour. So this is actually really a great time to hear a presentation on the politics of minimum wages in the US. And our two speakers today are Julia Payson and Gabor Simonovits, who I don't want to say, I mean, are fairly young scholars, and if I was to use a patronizing term, I could say they are up and coming, but they are not up and coming. They are already very confirmed scholars who have published in top journals in the US and in political science, who are two political scientists. So Gabor Simonovits is an assistant professor at CEU in Vienna, and I wanted to show you my badge to just say that we are all still with CEU. We stand with it, despite the fact it's moved to Vienna, and we stand with the whole, well, with Hungarian academia, and we hope that they will still recover their academic freedom one day. Gabor Simonovits from the political science department at CEU, and Julia is an assistant professor in politics at NYU. They both, I think it's fair to say, work on issues related to representation, public opinion. Gabor Simonovits, his work focuses more on attitudes towards public policies in the US and intergroup prejudice in Hungary. And he's also a methodologist. He's also published, for example, an influential paper on how research incentives can lead to the underrepresentation of null findings in published experimental studies. It's a very influential paper. Julia is also working on representation, public service provision, and I think you're working right now, or maybe you finalize on a book called When Cities Lobby, which looks actually at how cities have been lobbying their states in the US to attract funding. Without further ado, I'll ask everybody from their homes to welcome the two speakers today who will be talking now on minimum wages and the politics of minimum wages in the US. So welcome, Gabor and Julia.
Hi, so first of all, I really appreciate the invitation and also the kind words about CEU. So currently that this whole thing is less problematic, given that we are not forced to teach in Vienna, but that's definitely been a stressful time. So the paper that I want to talk about, and I'm gonna tell you in a nutshell both the questions and um, the kind of answers that that we got. We are studying the impact of or the relationship between decentralization and representation. And when I say representation, the kind of notion of representation that we are considering is some ideological distance between preferences in a certain place and public policies that are enacted in that place. And we are studying whether decentralizing policymaking can improve representation in this sense. And we are focusing on a very particular context here, which are local minimum wages in the US. And I'm gonna try to convince you that this is both an important policy domain to study this question, but equally importantly, as I'll show you, certain properties of minimum wages and the way minimum wage laws are set in the states make it very amenable to study this question. And just to anticipate what we are doing here, we are going to compare local minimum wages in cities that are enacted by the cities themselves versus local minimum wage which follow state policy or federal policy. And it's going to be a crucial element of our paper, that we can compare how citizens of different cities are represented by this policy, given that the institutional framework in which these policies are selected and enacted are different. And finally, to anticipate our key finding here is that based on our analysis, we show that that decentralization is no panacea to solve the problem of representation. So what we are going to show is that even though we see a real proliferation of these local policies set by cities, we fail to find evidence that these local policies are substantively better representing these local preferences. So I wanted to spend a few minutes on kind of introducing you this context, and just kind of last minute with Julia, we thought about maybe telling this story through an example. And so this story is about a very short-lived local minimum wage that was approved by the Birmingham City Council. So Birmingham is a city in Alabama in the US. And in I think 2016 or 15, the city council approved a pretty big increase in the local minimum wage. So this was a local policy that was going to increase the minimum wage that was mandated in that particular city, and that minimum wage was much higher than the prevailing minimum wage in the entire state. And this was definitely considered a big policy victory in the city, but almost less than a year later, the state of Alabama passed a law which is called a pre-emption law that essentially bans cities from setting any minimum wage that are different from the state policy. So basically what happened here was that a part of the state changed a particular policy, and and immediately after, the state said that no, you cannot do that. And so this was really a motivating story for our study, and it turns out that this is not really an anomaly. There has been many different states that passed such legislation to preempt local policy change, and some of them were actually reactive to these local policies set by cities, but some were actually preempting possible local legislation. So I'm just showing you a map here. So this map shows each American states, and the ones that are colored to blue have a preemption law that stops cities in these states from increasing their minimum wage. So you can see that it's not only that it's not an anomaly, it's actually a majority of states that do have such policy. And we are not gonna talk about this, but interestingly enough, these preemption laws are also not limited to minimum wages only. So there are many different policy domains in which U.S. states stop cities from making typically more progressive policies. And I think that this is just to kind of tell about the context of how we started to work on this together. So in a broader political context, you can also see that as a conflict over ideological mismatches between cities which are typically progressive and states which tend to be more conservative in the US. So what are some theoretical puzzles that we were trying to think through when exploring this question? So there is one which is very descriptive. So the question was, how well local policies reflect preferences? So if you observe that there are certain cities which enact very different public policies compared to each other, both in terms of the minimum wage and some other policies too, can we say that this variation across local policies reflects some genuine differences in preferences? And the second one, when we talk about these local policies, is whether the ability of these cities to set their own policies, does that improve representation compared to an alternative system where larger political units just set some uniform policies to each cities within them. So these were the two questions that we were trying to explore. And I think it's interesting so this is not really a theoretical paper, but I wanted to just sketch a few reasons why we could anticipate that decentralization would improve representation. So I think the most obvious one is and that has a very long intellectual tradition too, is that if you think that in a state there is a large degree of preference heterogeneity, then simply by allowing cities to choose heterogeneous policies, that's in principle going to improve the degree to which these local preferences are represented by policy. So just by allowing different places to have different policies, that should in principle lead to some notion of effectiveness in terms of policies. And then if you think about the politics of it, there are also certain theories in the politics of representation that would lead us to think that these smaller units are indeed better at selecting policies that are representing the interest of their voters. So I think one pretty convincing theoretical perspective on this is that if you have a polity where you have less preference heterogeneity, so voters want the same thing, then it's easier for them to hold their representatives accountable for the policies that they enact. So if you think of a city where there are many people who have these low-income jobs where they would make the minimum wage, then they could form a coalition more effectively to bring about policy change compared to a state that's much more heterogeneous in terms of preferences. And also, you could make the argument that these local legislators have more incentives to become informed. So you would reduce the problem of representatives making bad policies simply because they are not informed about citizen preferences. So this is I would say that this is the kind of the conventional wisdom that if you decentralize policies, you're gonna get outcomes which are closer to constituent preferences. But you could also think of reasons why this would not be the case. So, and I think that's maybe a more recent but pretty influential take on representation, is that you could imagine a case where the way policies are enacted, they are not really dependent on what typical voters want in a state or a city, but more dependent on what the political majority wants. So that would imply that in these more homogeneous political units such as cities, they are more homogeneous also in terms of the parties that they support, and you could get into a place where these very progressive cities consistently elect very progressive legislators, and in turn these legislators enact policies which are only catering to this progressive majority. Whereas if you consider a bigger political unit such as a state, you could expect more political competition in a larger polity. So maybe that would lead to more centrist outcomes, and you could avoid polarization exactly by representing a larger and more diverse political unit. And then a second case against why decentralization could actually make things worse in terms of policy representation is goes back to Thibault and the notion of Thibault sorting. So in the context of the minimum wage, that's a very appealing idea, that you could imagine that these smaller political units would try to compete with each other, and they would start this kind of race to the bottom, which would mean that none of these cities would want to enact too progressive policies, in the fear that they would that would lead to a flood of businesses to other cities. So you could imagine that a centralized solution where a bigger political unit just sets local policies that could preempt that kind of sorting. So on the face of it, these questions seem very easy. So both the notion of representation and decentralization are very central topics in political science. So the question is, why don't we already know how these things work? So I want to spend a few minutes on convincing you this is indeed pretty hard to get at both good measures of policy representation as well as how representation would be impacted by decentralization. So first, I want to talk about measurement here. So it's fairly straightforward to imagine a way to measure policy outcomes in some ideological sense. So if you picked a few cities or countries, you could easily come up with a ranking of how liberal or conservative policy outcomes are in these places. And you could do the same thing with local preferences. But a big problem in the literature is that if you want to get at how well policies represent preferences in an ideological sense, you need to measure these two constructs in the same scale. And it turns out that this is pretty much not trivial, and the literature has struggled with this really big time. So essentially what you need here is that you need to be able to figure out what is the actual policy that citizens on average would want in a particular place. So this is the 45-degree line. And only if you have these two things measured on the same scale can you talk about something called policy bias, which is a measure of how far public policies fall from average preferences in an ideological sense. So it turns out that this is one reason why studying the minimum wage is very appealing, because it's very straightforward to think of minimum wages as easily placeable on these ideological scales, and they are measured in intuitive units. So in this case, we can measure minimum wages in dollars, and in principle, we could measure local preferences about the minimum wage by just simply calculating the average minimum wage a certain place would want. So why do we study minimum wages? So I already kind of told you the story in the beginning, but just to reiterate here, one reason why we study the minimum wage is that it's a relevant policy. So you just talked about the new president having this pretty high on his agenda. It's a salient policy. You can also imagine most voters to have some preferences over this. So it's not like an arcane thing where we would not really expect any sort of representation in the first place. Second, it's also a scalable policy in the sense that you can make these kind of ideological comparisons pretty easily. And most importantly for our purposes here, at least in the context that we study here, which are American cities, there is some variation in the degree to which these policies are decentralized. So what does it mean? So I wanted to show you a few examples of how exactly minimum wages are enacted in American cities. So these are 4 cities: Nashville, Boston, New York City, and San Francisco. And I want to go through how minimum wages are actually calculated in these places. So first of all, there is a central policy, the federal minimum wage, that mandates that anywhere in the US, people should get at least $7.25 per hour. So this is a federal policy that each business in the US needs to follow. And then there is another layer on this, which is state level policies. And there are actually, it turns out that there are different kinds of state policies. So one state policy that we've already discussed in the very beginning is something called a pre-emption law, which says that a state cannot have a minimum wage. Sorry, a city in that state cannot have a minimum wage beyond a certain threshold. So for instance, Nashville, which is in Tennessee, is subject to a state minimum wage law that says that the Tennessee minimum wage is 7.25, and no city in that state can have a minimum wage above that. In contrast, there are states like Massachusetts, where Boston is, that set a higher state minimum wage compared to the federal minimum wage. So Massachusetts is a minimum wage about $12.70. Moreover, Massachusetts also allows cities in Massachusetts to set minimum wages higher than the state level minimum wage. So this means that the Massachusetts minimum wage on one hand allows cities to enact higher minimum wage than the one mandated by the state. And on the other hand, it also says that cities have to have a minimum wage above the state minimum wage here. Sorry, that must have been very complicated, but I'm gonna give you some more examples too. The third kind of minimum wage is the one in New York State, where New York City is. So in New York, similarly to Massachusetts, there is a state minimum wage that's greater than the federal minimum wage. At the same time, there is also preemption there. So every city in New York has to set a minimum wage higher than the federal minimum wage, but they cannot set themselves a higher one than the state one. And then finally, California, where San Francisco is, that's the same as Boston. There is a state minimum wage that's higher than the federal minimum wage, and cities are allowed to set even higher minimum wages. So now comes the third layer on this, which is policies that are set by cities rather than states. So it turns out that there are cities such as Boston that could set a local minimum wage, but they choose not to. So in those cities, the state minimum wage prevails. In cities like Nashville, where city minimum wages are preempted, even if they wanted to, they couldn't set a city minimum wage. There are cities like San Francisco that are allowed to set local minimum wages, and they do so. So in San Francisco, there's a city minimum wage at $15, which is actually higher than what's mandated by the state. And finally, there's this very strange category that exists in New York State and Oregon, where certain cities are made to enact higher minimum wages than the state, but this decision is made by the state itself and not the city. So this is called a tiered policy, where the state sets policies that vary across different cities. So it's a complicated story, but the gist of it is that there are basically 4 categories. One called a preempted city, which means that, such as Nashville, where the state prohibits local minimum wages. There's a second category called tiered, such as New York City, where the state law mandates a local minimum wage. A third category called state, where a city could implement a local minimum wage, but they don't. And finally, a local minimum wage, where the minimum wage in the city is set by the city itself, such as San Francisco. So now I have, in 20 more minutes, I'm going to show you how we get at this question empirically. So the first thing we had to do is that we wanted to collect public opinion data on the minimum wage. And what's special in the data that we collected compared to most survey data is that we asked survey takers in this public opinion survey to tell what they think the minimum wage should be in their city on a numerical scale. So they were actually, so this was an online survey, and each participant of this survey was asked to type in a number on their phone or laptop, such as 10 or 15 or 8 or 0 if they didn't want any minimum wage. So we were basically able to measure their preference about the minimum wage on a meaningful scale, rather than the more typical measure, which is, do you support raising the minimum wage to $15 or $12? So what we argue in the paper is that this is a more precise and nuanced way to measure preferences, and it also allows us to calculate the degree to which local policies are different or similar from average preferences. So the major challenge for us in comparing city level preferences to city level policies was that we needed to estimate preferences in cities, and there are really many cities. So even though we have a really large sample for a survey, above 18,000 people, for most cities we have very few survey respondents. So this is simply a consequence of there being really a large number of cities. So what we needed to do is to come up with a model that helps us to estimate local preferences in the presence of such sparse data. And we follow best practice. So this approach is called multi-level modeling with post-ratification, or MRP, to come up with these model-based estimates for local preferences. And so what this process is doing is basically 2 steps. So the first step is to build a statistical model that, together with survey data, allows us to predict individual preferences for types of individuals. And I'm going to tell you exactly what these types of individuals are. And second, to come up with local estimates of preferences. So let's say average preference in Nashville or average preference in San Francisco, by weighting together these predictions that we get from our model with weights that are telling us the size of different groups for which we obtain estimates. I'm going to tell you very specifically what this means. But I first want to go through what the multi-level model is. So how do we make predictions for different groups based on our data and the model? So what we do is that we model the survey response, which is this answer about what the minimum wage should be. So this is a number, and we model this number as a function of 2 kinds of variables. The first kind of variable is demographic groups, such as sex, ethnicity, age, levels of education, okay? The second group of variables that we include in the model are so-called contextual predictors, which vary not at the level of individuals, but rather at the level of cities. So for instance, we include two kinds of such contextual predictors. One is local voting patterns. So what's the percentage of voters that voted for the Democrats in the last election, which we thought was going to be predictive of these survey responses, given that there was this big break between support for minimum wages among Democrats and Republicans. So we expected that in very conservative places, the average voter would want a lower minimum wage, and in very liberal places, the average voter would want a higher minimum wage. And the second variable that we put in our model is rental prices. So there, the reasoning was that given some ideology that the average voter has, we expected that the same person would want a higher minimum wage in a place that's more expensive. So what we do is that we use this model, and from the model, we get predictions for types of individuals. So a type of individual is someone who belongs to a certain demographic group in a certain city, okay? So for instance, I'm showing you two types here. So the first type here is someone who has a college degree, is Hispanic, female, and from Menlo Park, which is a small city in California, okay? So these are the groups for which we want to make predictions. And then the key intuition in this modeling approach is that it allows us to make predictions even for cities from which no one is in our sample, which is very weird. Because if you imagine we have 18,000 individuals in our survey, okay, and we make predictions for about 15,000 cities. So even if these cities were similar in their sizes, it would be very likely that we end up with no one from certain cities. And given that there are certain cities which are very small, it turns out to be the case that for the majority of the cities in our sample, we don't observe, for the majority of the cities that we want to analyze, we don't observe anyone from there in our survey. So it's very important for us to be able to predict this ideal minimum wage even in cities where we don't observe anyone. So how do we do that? So this is the example I wanted to show you. So let's imagine that we have these two individuals in our survey. So let's say that these first two columns in our data set actually people that we interviewed in our survey. So the first person was from Menlo Park, the second person was from Palo Alto. And they both said that ideally they would want the minimum wage to be $12 in that particular city where they lived. And it turns out that these two individuals, they belong to the same demographic category for our purposes. They're both females, they're both Hispanic, they both have a college degree. Moreover, they're from the same state. And even though they're from different cities, these cities are pretty similar to each other. So they're similar to each other in the sense that they are both very highly democratic and they are both very expensive, okay? So from this information, maybe our model can learn that places which are expensive and similar in terms of their voting patterns, and then in these two cities, people who belong to the same demographic groups, they're gonna say similar responses to these survey questions. So let's say that we have a third person, okay, who again belongs to the same demographic group, okay, but that person lives in a third city called Mountain View, which is also in California, which is also very expensive and also very democratic. So even though that person doesn't show up in our survey, we can guess that it's likely that this person would also have a similar minimum wage preference compared to these two people that we just met. So this is kind of the intuition of this model, that that using the survey data that we establish some patterns between the survey response, geographic and demographic variables. And based on that, we can extrapolate to geographical units and types that we don't even observe. So the last thing that we need to do is something called post-ratification, which is to take our estimate of minimum wage preferences, which are defined for demographic and geographic groups. So from this model that we estimate, we get estimates for the average minimum wage preference for, let's say, a Hispanic college degree, a Hispanic female with a college degree from New York City. But at the end, we want to know the average minimum wage preference in New York City. So we want to know the proportion of these demographic groups in each city, so that we can calculate these city level averages. So the way this goes is that we have at some point in this estimation process, we come up with a data set that tells us the predicted preferences about the minimum wage for each of these demographic groups. And if we know how many, so what's the proportion of these different demographic groups, then we can calculate the total predicted preference or the average predicted preference as a simple weighted average. So one issue, and I promise that's going to be the last kind of subtle methodological detail. So one issue here is that these joint demographic distributions are not available. So it turns out that there is no data set that we can use to figure out what's the percentage of college-educated white males in Palo Alto. So the reason why this data doesn't exist is a result of the way the Census Bureau reports these kind of demographic statistics in the US. So we have to do an additional step, which is to estimate the distribution of these demographic types based on the product of the marginal distribution. So basically, just to simplify this, if you're interested in the percentage of Hispanic college-educated females in Palo Alto, and we don't know this proportion, we collect the marginal distributions, which is the percentage of Hispanics in Palo Alto, the percentage of college-educated people in Palo Alto, the percentage of females in Palo Alto. So this data is available, and we estimate these joint population shares or demographic shares as a product of these marginal distributions. And it turns out that it's a really nice and useful statistical result. And even though these proportions that we estimate this way are going to be biased or not going to be imprecise, the predictions that we get when we use them to weight our predictions at the city level are going to be unbiased. So now I'm in the position of showing you the results. So first, I wanted to show you some evidence that our estimates of minimum wage preferences at this low level of aggregation are actually valid in some sense. So the kind of validation exercise that we conducted was to compare our estimates of city level minimum wages to county level voting returns, as well as the median rents in these cities. And it turns out that both of these variables that we have some theoretical reasons to believe to be related to them are actually very strongly predictive of our estimates of local minimum wage preferences. So now I want to show you some preliminary results. So these are our estimates of local preferences in some large cities, okay? So these are the black dots in the middle. We report confidence intervals around these estimates to reflect that these are coming from a model, so we are kind of uncertain about what these are. And finally, we also report the actual local minimum wages in these cities. So the minimum wages, the policies, are denoted by these triangles. In some places like San Francisco, these triangles are to the right from our preference estimates, meaning that the minimum wages are higher than the average preference. There are certain places like Portland and Baltimore where the policies are pretty close to our estimates of the average preference. And again, there are some places such as Houston or Dallas or Nashville, which I talked a bunch about, where the preferences are much higher than the policies. So we see that there is some relationship between preferences and policies, but in general, they are either the policies are either too high, so minimum wages are either too high compared to preferences, or they are too low. Okay, so now to systematically compare preferences and policies for all cities, I show you a plot where each little dot is one city, and for the largest cities, I also show you the name of the city. So again, it shows that these two variables are correlated. So the variation in minimum wages is indeed predicted by our estimates of preferences, but in general, they are pretty far. So if you remember back to this this figure, this kind of schematized figure that I showed you in the very beginning, we would want, so if you only care about policies to be close to preferences, we would want each of these cities to lie out on this line. But it turns out that they are not. So in fact, most of these cities are pretty far from these lines. So the question is, what does it all have to do with decentralization? So can we say that these cities have policies which are far from average local preferences because they're just because their state in which they are just pushes them on them? And does this lack of representation get solved when cities get to choose their own policies, or is that not the case? So what we do here is that we come up with a measure of representation that we call bias, which is simply the difference between average preferences and the policies. So if these values are higher, that means, so the higher are these values, the more conservative bias we observe. Because if these values are higher, it means that the preferences are much higher than the policies. And so this figure shows the distribution of this measure of policy bias, okay, for these four groups of cities where the minimum wage comes about in these different institutional channels. And what we see here is basically two main patterns. So one pattern is, which is not very surprising, is that in cities where the cities themselves chose the local minimum wage, we see a much more liberal bias compared to cities that cannot choose their minimum wages, in a sense. So these are the preempted cities. So what this shows is that if you stop cities from setting their own policies, then this will result in a conservative bias. And if you let cities set their own policies, that's gonna lead to a liberal policy bias, in the sense that you have policies which are which are too generous compared to what the average voter would want. And it turns out that the fourth category, which is the tiered system where the state mandates minimum wages which vary across cities in the state, these seem like the best. So in terms of average bias, they're the closest to zero. So we also have, so I'm not gonna go through all of these numbers, but what these show is that if you look at the sign difference between preferences and policies, so this is kind of the ideological direction to which policies are off compared to preferences on average, we see that cities which are preempted, they experience a larger than average policy bias, and cities that set their own minimum wages, they experience a lower than average, sorry, a more liberal than average policy bias. But when we look at the absolute differences, okay, so we look at how far these points are from zero on average. So how far are these dots from the 45-degree line? You observe that actually both local minimum wages and preempted minimum wages are pretty bad. So it seems that preempted minimum wages are the worst in terms of absolute policy bias. So this is the average absolute difference between policies and preferences. And it seems that preempted cities fare the worst, and then cities with their own local minimum wages, and then tiered, and then state. So the last set of results that I want to show you, and I promise I'll be done, is to look at a more interesting question possibly than these descriptive results, which are concerned with what would happen in these cities if the policy would change, or more precisely, how would this degree of representation change if you change the way in which policies are enacted? You would change the degree of decentralization. So if you want to do this, we cannot just compare these different groups of cities, because these cities differ from each other in many other ways. So for instance, Nashville is different from San Francisco, not only because San Francisco chose its own minimum wage and Nashville didn't, but there are just a lot of other differences. So if you want to make some causal claim about what would happen if the degree of decentralization changed, we need to do something more subtle, which is to look at what would happen if we suddenly centralized policies. So it turns out that if we simulate what would happen with the degree of representation under these centralizing policies, such as what would happen if the federal minimum wage would be increased to $10, or it would be increased to $15, or another centralizing policy that we consider is a centralized minimum wage, which is tied to local rents. So that would mean that there is a central policy that says that each city needs to adjust their minimum wage to a certain proportion of housing prices. So it turns out that we can look at the causal impact on these changes on policy bias and absolute policy bias, and it turns out that they are very different from each other. So we see, for instance, that if the federal minimum wage was increased only modestly to $10, that would very drastically cut policy bias. So policy bias would fall basically to 50% in absolute terms, okay? But a more aggressive increase in the federal minimum wage to $15, that would actually double policy bias. So it turns out that the consequences of these counterfactual changes to the federal minimum wage are very sensitive to the degree of these changes. So I didn't say how we calculated these. So the way we calculated these was to hold average preferences fixed and change the actual minimum wages, what they would become had these federal minimum wage hikes been implemented. So that basically means that if we are considering the impact of a federal minimum wage increase to $10, we would take all cities that currently have a minimum wage that is less than $10 and change it to $10. With the other cities, nothing would change. If you consider the impact of a minimum wage raise to $15, we would take all cities which have a minimum wage less than $15 and shift them to $15. So it turns out that we can use this framework to make these quite precise inferences about what would happen as a result of these policy changes in terms of our measure of representation. So just to wrap up, I've been talking for too long. What we did here was to introduce a novel approach to estimate local policy bias. So I think we are the first, so ours is the first paper to quantify the degree to which local policy is different from what local voters would want on some well-defined scale. And we show that even though this is what the conventional wisdom holds, decentralization doesn't necessarily lead to public policies which are closer to local preference, at least for the minimum wages. And finally, we consider some counterfactual policy changes and show that even though they would centralize the way policies are implemented, such as increasing the federal minimum wage or introducing a system where each city needs to follow the same rules in aligning its minimum wages to local housing prices. So each of these, so some of these centralizing policies would actually improve representation. But just to finish with reacting to the original question, like, do we think that the increasing the federal minimum wage to $15 is a good idea? Well, according to our calculations, that at least to in the sense of making policies more or less aligned with local preferences on average, in this sense, it would be a bad idea. Of course, for some people, that would be good, for some people bad, but on average, it would reduce the degree to which preferences would be reflected in policy. So this is all I had, and we're looking forward to questions.
Thanks, Gabor. Thank you very much for a very clear presentation on what is actually, I mean, is a methodologically sophisticated paper. And I'm sure there will be questions on the method itself. There will be also questions on the policy. I'm very much appreciative that you seem to have applied, you know, the kind of Rawlsian principle, a max-min strategy in terms of presenting the method in the sense that you've tried to really present it clearly to an audience that is not necessarily familiar with the method. And so you've been trying to maximize the utility of those who are at the bottom of the distribution in terms of methodological sophistication. And I very much like that. Now, I just wanted to say, right, that from now, for the Q&A will not be recorded. So all those who have questions, feel free to use your mic and video to